If you go back into history, were clear indications and clear supporting anecdotal comments that could have given us warning or clues to the impact that these experiences would have on individuals. And I thought I would share with you some of them because they are quotes that I came across in the course of my own personal research. And then I want to share with you from the personal perspective of the words of women who served, what the process is that individuals go through in terms of both caring for casualties and then trying to come to terms with that experience. The fact that I entitled this talk, Wounded Healers, the Impact of Combat Casualty Care on Military Nursing, I think it's only fitting that I would open it up with a paragraph from Florence Nightingale's biography. You know, Florence Nightingale is considered to be the founder of modern nursing, and certainly we all learned a great deal about Florence Nightingale when we were in school, and learned about her work in the Crimea, in Scutari during the Crimean War. What we didn't learn was that Florence Nightingale's life was irrevocably changed by her experiences in the Crimea, and that after her return, she never went back to bedside nursing. And this was a quote from her biography that was written in 1951. She said she had seen hell, and because she had seen hell, she was set apart. Between her and every normal human pleasure, every normal human enjoyment, must stand the wards of Scutari. She could never forget. She wrote the words again and again in private notes on the margins of letters, on scraps of blotting paper. Whenever her hand lay idle, the phrase formed itself, "I can never forget." If we move on through the literature, we can find writings from other eras as well. We can find from World War I the writing of a Red Cross nurse who served on the Russian front, whose name was Florence Farnborough, who wrote in a book that she wrote, "Now for me the war is over and my Red Cross work is done. I cannot express the dreadful emptiness which has come into my life. Anna Ivanova found me weeping one day. I could not tell her why, because I myself did not know. She said it was reaction. I did not contradict her, but I knew it was something much deeper than that. As I looked through these fragmentary notes of mine, I relived all the tragic scenes again and asked myself, was it I, really I, who saw that? Was it I, really I, who did that? From where had the strength come to endure those ghastly moments? I shivered at the memories they brought back. I recalled the desolate battlefields and saw the soldiers lying amid the twisted wires and shell cavities. Will they be remembered? But who could remember all those many thousands and thousands? And finally, from a nurse who served on Bataan and Corregidor during World War II, during the fall of the Philippines, Juanita Redmond. I had still not grown accustomed to seeing people torn and bleeding and dying in numbers like these. When one patient dies, it is agonizing enough. When you are faced by such mass suffering and death, something cracks inside of you, and you can't ever be quite the same again. Despite those statements that demonstrate so clearly the impact that combat casualty care has on the people who take care of them, nurses who served in the military were always considered to be non-combatants. And throughout military history, that assumption was made that because they were non-combatants, they had not been exposed to any of the stresses associated with war zone service. In fact, women were excluded from all the research that was ever done on combat veterans until the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study was done in 1988. Women went home, they did not talk about their experiences, and because their numbers were so few, they lived in significant isolation. I have a friend of mine who always says that the nurses who, that 90% of the nurses who went to Vietnam were 21-year-old Irish Catholics who went to 3-year hospital schools of nursing. I think that's a somewhat embellished statement, but I think what it does do is draw a picture of the kind of person that went to Vietnam. Because in fact, yes, women were volunteers. Every woman who went volunteered to certainly join the military, if not go to Vietnam. Back in those days, 30 years ago, which is very hard to believe, nurses did not go to universities and colleges for their education. They went to hospital schools of nursing, and many people will tell you that experience is very much like living in a cloistered kind of environment than convent, because it was a primarily female-dominated kind of institution. And nurses, again, at that point in time, were usually from the lower middle class, because nursing was seen as a way to get up and out and improve oneself. And the education associated with it was not as expensive as going to university. In the Vietnam generation, many of the women, just like the men, came from families where their parents and uncles and some of their aunts had served during World War II. And they were brought up with the belief of, with the value system that is maybe perhaps a little foreign to us today, of a responsibility to God, honor, and country, as some of the prior speakers have talked about. And really fell subject to President Kennedy's very moving inaugural address, where he said, ask not what your country would do for you, but what you would do for your country. And when you stand up here today, 30 years later, I stand up here today, I think that really sounds so corny in some ways, but I also know that it was very real 30 years ago, and that it impacted many of us in our hearts. And so these young women went off to Vietnam, and as the studies will show you, that the majority of women, nurses who served in Vietnam, were under the age of 25. So what that tells you also is that they had very limited life experience and very limited experience in their profession. And they were about to be exposed to a level of trauma care that the world had never seen up at that point in time. And I wanted to share with you from the book that I co-edited with Linda Vandevant, Visions of War, Dreams of Peace, the poetry, because I think in the women's own words, they really show the process of what happens to someone when they are called upon to do this kind of work. And I want to start out by reading 2 poems by the same author. The author's name is Dana Schuster, and Dana served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. And the first poem that I'm going to read to you is from her first tour. She wrote it early on, and I think it really demonstrates some of what I'm trying to say, and also where she was at during this very, her first early experience. And this poem was written in 1966, and it's entitled, Like Swans on Still Water. Like swans on still water, they skim over the war, our dyes gliding, rustling serenely, gleaming black hair pulled primly away from faces that reveal nothing save inner repose, a beauty so deep even war can't defile. I note my reflection in their obsidian eyes, an outsized barbarian, ungainly, unkempt, baggy in ever-wilted greens, 5-pound boots taking plow-hand strides, face perpetually ruddy, dripping in alien heat. In their delicate presence, I exhume teenage failures. The girl in the back row forever unnoticed. The one no one ever invited to dance. The one never voted most likely anything. The one who was never quite something enough. But once in a while, on a crazy shift morning, when I've worked through the night and I'm too tired to care, a young man who reeks of rice paddies lies waiting for someone to heal the new hole in his life. He says through his pain, all adolescent bravado, "Hey, what's your name? Let's get married, I love you." And just for a moment, I become Nefertiti, and for all the Orient's pearls and silks, I would not trade the glamour and privilege of these honored hands, licensed to touch one filthy GI. Towards the end of her second tour, she wrote a poem called Second Tour. And this was in 1967. And this is what she wrote. Today was an ordinary day in the OR, the usual allotment of train wrecks and gawks, a sprinkling of crispy kidders among the occasional mix and match and numberless gooks. I remember a day when it wasn't so, when the OR was nothing but chaos and carnage. A day when I swore I would never see mere train wrecks and gawks, crispy kidders and gooks, instead of people hurting more than I. Sometimes I wonder which day's casualty logs bears my name. And I really think that shows the dramatic transition an individual has from where they were when they went to where they ended up by the time their tour was over. And then, of course, when we talk about the homecoming, and I mentioned that people did not recognize the experience that these individuals, these women, had had in Vietnam, and they had to live by themselves with their memories and their thoughts, isolated from their colleagues, and really hidden from society. I wrote an article during that time called Nobody Ever Wondered If a Woman Was in the War. And it was an interesting experience in my writing that article and submitting it to some nursing journals to try to get them to publish it, because although every editor wrote back and thought it was a very good article, they really didn't want to publish it because they thought it was much too depressing and didn't give the right perspective on the women who served and might upset them. At the time, we were trying to outreach to people, to educate the people, and to let them know what it was that this experience had done to individuals and where they were at the present time. And what I did with that story, I guess if no one else will publish it, you publish it yourself, if you think it's important. So I turned it into a poem, and I put it in this book. And it's interesting that I will tell you that for many years, I wouldn't share these things with people, these feelings, because I felt like so many other nurses did, that it would make some kind of negative statement about myself and my competence and my professional abilities, and that people would judge me very harshly if they knew what I was experiencing and what I had felt. But as I began to heal and as people began to reach out to me, I felt that I then could reach out to other people and share part of my experience. So the article that started out, Nobody Ever Wondered If a Woman Was in the War, turned into a poem, and I will tell you it is a little lengthy. It's a poem I wrote, actually, and I guess it's only fitting that that I read it here, because I was telling a friend of mine, I was at the first conference that ended up into being the Traumatic Stress Society back in Kings Island, Ohio in 1982. It was then called Post-Vietnam Syndrome. Some of you I know were there, you might remember that. And I wrote that original article when I came home. And just kept it for years, and then I revised it and put it in this book. And the title of this poem is Some Days, and I'll read it to you. Some days I can't help but remember. Who knows what triggers it today, 18 years later? The game was war, the prize survival. The toys were guns and tanks, mortars and grenades. White phosphorus, I remember it well. A charred body, shades of black, shades of white. A 10-year-old boy, dying. War, a term that conjures up visions of firefights and battlefields, not mass casualties, traumatic injuries, or triage. Choppers, the worrying reminder of life and death, damaged and disabled young men brought to a different fight, the fight for one more life, the struggle for one more day. Some days I can't help but remember when these very young men, without their arms or legs or half of their faces, looked to me for hope, encouragement, strength, or peace. Where hidden behind my smile of "it'll be okay" was the burden of the lie that knew that it wouldn't. Anger, the silent, stoic anger. The anger at the death, the anger at the carnage, the anger at the demands that could not be met, the pain that could not be stopped, the wounds that could not be healed, the tears that could not be shed. Yes, some days I can't help but remember, standing there, surrounded by beds filled with young men, hearing the cries or the whispered requests, relief from the pain, some moral support, a minute or two of extra time. But there never seemed to be enough time, and there never seemed to be enough hands, and there never seemed to be enough me to respond to the cries and the sighs. So soon I discovered, with no time for tears, become numb to the pain, become numb to the cries, become numb to the death, walk away from the grief. And some days I can't help but remember, reaching out to find a friend, to hold a hand, to seek a peace, to find some respite from war. Yet even then I soon did learn that some would leave and never come back from their last fight or their last flight. But I didn't call in sick in Vietnam, and I didn't say I need a day off because my friend just died. After all, in Vietnam, somebody's friend died every day. So I went on knowing a part of my youth died every day, a part of my soul was lost. Learning so clearly without a doubt, there's no such thing as a respite from war. And some days I can't help but remember that when I came home, when I finally came home, I came home to a life that no longer was real. Sometimes I tried to explain, other times I just stayed mute, feeling at first that they wouldn't understand, feeling really that they didn't want to hear, knowing for sure that they'd never really know. Then I discovered that I couldn't play. Strangely, I found I forgot how to laugh. And amazingly enough, I didn't want to work. Doctors didn't come on the very first call, and I knew in Vietnam that's all it would take. One call to say, I need you here now, and there they would be as soon as I called. Because they knew if I said, I need you here now, a life was at stake, or I wouldn't have called. And some days I can't help but remember, realizing that I really didn't care, that the lady down the hall was complaining of pain and wouldn't get up and walk down the hall. What right had she to complain of such pain? A gallbladder, after all, was not the same pain as the kind you get from shattered legs and arms and soles. Yet I knew I was wrong down deep somewhere, but I also knew and couldn't understand why they didn't know that people over there were dying and dying, continually dying. They didn't seem to know, and they didn't seem to care. They seemed to think I should be glad to be home, when much to my surprise, I found out that I wasn't. And I chose that poem because I think it really demonstrates so much of the symptomatology that we see in PTSD, from the intrusive thoughts and the nightmares and the memories, down to the anger and the alienation and the trying to fit in, the emotional numbing and the inability to reconnect with the society that you return into. I think, in closing, that when we look at the legacy from Vietnam and from the words that are written in this book, I know today that this book is used to help people heal who are caregivers in disasters, who are serving in intensive care units, that the experience of the women in Vietnam, and I think part of the motivating factor behind Linda and I publishing this book was not because we thought it was great literature, but because we thought it was essential that the words and the experiences of the women get out. When we first started contacting the 60 authors who were in this book, most of them said, you can use my poem, but don't use my name. They wanted to be anonymous because they didn't want to own the feelings. We spent hours on the phone convincing people and sending them other people's work, saying you got to own it because it's the only way we'll change the perception if people know it's real people behind these words. And fortunately, that has happened, so that we have begun to see a change in the way that people are dealt with. Unfortunately, I think we haven't seen the change in the preparation and the understanding and the acknowledgement of what combat casualty care is really about. So in closing, I'm going to read a poem that Linda wrote while she was sitting at home watching TV during the buildup of the Persian Gulf. And she entitled it Middle East Montage. Steamy summer sunup, wearily I sip my morning coffee and watch the early news. A C-130 unloads in the background. The line of soldiers marching across the screen wears Desert Sam camouflage instead of jungle green. And they're still just kids. Bryant interviews 2 fresh young nurses in fatigues. We're here to do our part, committed to our country's goals. We're highly skilled and trained, prepared for anything. We've worked civilian ER, so we've seen it all. A chill runs through me. My God, they have no idea. Thank you very much.
I'd like to open up the next session for any comments or questions for the panel.
Weariness is taking over.
It is a long day. Alan, do you have?
Yeah, I was thinking of what you were saying regarding the legacy the Vietnam veterans have made in terms of telling the stories and animating it in a way that other veterans have had difficulty with. And I recall back in the earthquake of '89, we had to cancel a group in Oakland, and we reconvened the group the next week, and the guys were very angry of these stories that were coming out and this sort of thing on the front page of, if you're having any of these symptoms, and they're describing symptoms of PTSD, please call this list of professionals who are willing to offer their time and energy free of charge. And this incensed the veterans, and they're saying, where were these do-gooders when we came back from the war? And I was thinking, in terms of the reframing self, what do I say to that? And I thought, well, it was through your courage and, you know, that coming forth and doing what you've done that's helping others. And, you know, the cynics respond, but I think it's probably through that a lot of veterans have felt that they've given back, even though they paid quite a price. But I thought that was a very chilling moment, you know, of where were these people when it could have made a difference, and now when maybe our courage is making a difference for other folks. And I'd like
Also
to leave with that image in
that
their
Desert
heads.
Storm, they felt the same way when they had this, you know, incredible parade of people coming back from there. They felt again that same sense of why wasn't anybody there for us? So I think that may be a continuum. But what was very gratifying to me was the incredible numbers of letters I got from veterans saying, thank you for this book because I know I'm not alone. This concept of sharing their stories was of monumental importance to many, many other veterans. And I think that if you know them, tell them that what they've done has created a whole volume of literature, if you want to call it literature, or thought processes that other people can use. It's just a shame when all the books go out of print.
Do you think that, especially for Vietnam vets, and we're talking 30 years later, is it still important to share those stories? And if it is, then why has the treatment models that the VA is using, why has it shifted away from that?
I would like to know what you're talking about. They're not doing the vet centers as much, you mean, and the concept of conversational healing is not there anymore?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. Number one, I think number one, it is important to tell the stories. I think for a lot of reasons, and I think part of what Greg said was the whole issue of oral history. I think that telling the stories are an important part of treatment. I think there are a lot of different treatment modalities out there. I think my experience is that most people hold on to that as part of treatment has to be telling the story. I think the difficulty that clinicians may have encountered is that there's more to treatment than just telling the story. You have to tell the story, but there are other things that you have to do if you're going to get on with your life and integrate that. I never say put it behind you, because I don't think it's something you put behind you. I think it's something you integrate into your being, and you move on with it. And I think that in the early years of treatment, people thought just telling the story would heal. And I think what we learned over time is that it doesn't. There are other things that people do, and that there are other responsibilities that they have to take on in treatment. And that's where the healing occurs. And telling the story is only one part.
I disagree just slightly, because when I was interviewing, the best of the people who ran the vet centers, even back in 79 and 80, were saying, we really have to get beyond it. You tell the story, but then we have to give them some sense of their own personal responsibility for taking charge of their own life as it is now. And I thought that was a very strong factor about the vet centers. In fact, that was the one thing I liked so much about it, was that they were not just letting you wallow in if that's the word. I don't think wallowing is correct, but it's too pejorative. But just reliving and re-grieving and was not going to do it. That you had to go forward and that you had to take your own responsibility. And I had any number of people at both the top level and at the lesser levels running individual centers who thought that way.
Yeah, and I think, and I do understand that there needs to be some sort of a marriage between the telling of the story and finding closure, and then maybe reframing the cognitions about this telling of the story and the role that the veteran had or his own role in the story. My concern is that we've gotten rid of the telling the story. We've moved right to the closure before we've even allowed anybody to tell the story. And if we're following managed care models that ask you to make 3 wishes and solve your problems, and we're having activities of daily living skills groups for PTSD patients, and never asking them to tell their story first.
Let me just make a comment about that. And I think the whole afternoon there's going to be all kinds of experts up here who are more capable of addressing that question in its entirety. But from a personal perspective, I'll give one other comment, and I think it's important for us to remember that the individuals that are in treatment today for PTSD, certainly from Vietnam, have been symptomatic and living with these symptoms, probably not very well, for 30 years. And over that 30 years, they have developed a range of issues and behaviors that are very, very different than the person who went into treatment in 1979 or 80, 82. The symptoms are much more ingrained and requires a whole different level and approach to treatment. So it's an evolving thing. As I said, the experts on that are going to be up here this afternoon after lunch, so I would just urge, and I know a lot of them I see them out there in the audience, so we'll just make sure that they respond to that when they get up here in the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Joan. We're going to pause now for lunch. Before we do pause, I want to remind people that Myra McPherson will be signing 10 books. Also, I did want to make one statement that we try to know our audience the best we can, and we understand that there are many people here, and that this is a provocative subject. If you do experience difficulties because of the content area, there are trained clinicians here who have volunteered to speak with you about it. So please approach me or someone else if you'd like that. Otherwise, we'll reconvene at 1:30.
The downside, the back row.